Alrighty. Actually, Japan has changed a lot. Now, I don't know who said Japan hasn't changed a lot since, I suppose, the 1990s, according to Noah Smith, but this seemed like an interesting article to, I guess, learn about how Japan has changed in the last 30 years. I think that the biggest narrative coming out of Japan seems to pretty much just be that their population's decreasing. Like, I don't really hear a lot about the Japanese economy other than their population's decreasing, and that's going to be a real problem. I hear, like, in economic circles, you hear a pretty good amount about their central bank sort of extreme quantitative easing stance, but, I don't think, that's pretty much it, though. I mean, you don't really hear a lot about what the fuck actually is going on in Japan, other than, yeah, by the way, their population's decreasing. Also, their central bank really, really, really believes in quantitative easing. But that's pretty much it, So let's hopefully this is a pretty good rundown of like all the different, perhaps big structural changes in Japan over the last 30 years by Noah Smith. So let's see. Reading the widely discussed farewell essay by the BBC's outgoing Tokyo correspondent Rupert Wingfield Hayes. That is an interesting name. I felt a deep sense of frustration. The veteran journalist summed up his impression of Japan, where he has lived and worked since 2012, as one of stagnation and stasis, declaring that after a decade here, I have got used to the way Japan is and come to accept the fact that it is not about to change. And yet, as someone who has lived in Japan and who has gone back there for about a month out of every year since 2011, and who has written fairly extensively about the country's economy, I can tell you that that it absolutely has changed in important and highly visible ways. But before I go through Wingfield Hayes' article and explain all the things I think it gets wrong, I should say that although I've never met him, he seems like a good guy who honestly wants to see Japan do better than it's doing. And some of his criticisms he makes are both accurate and very important. For example, I think he's absolutely right to identify gerontocracy as Japan's fundamental problem. Wingfield Hayes points to political gerontocracy, elderly voters maintaining the power of an elderly ossified political class. But I think an equally or even more important problem is corporate gerontocracy, the near universal practice of seniority-based promotion, combined with low startup rates and population aging, has led to an ossified class of corporate executives and managers who would rather preside comfortably over declining little empires than embrace new technologies and business models and take new risks. This, in turn, has caused Japanese companies to fall behind foreign rivals as they miss technological revolution after revolution, microprocessors, smartphones, semiconductor foundries, battery-powered cars, etc. An interesting addendum to this might actually be changing. I don't know. I saw a news article the other day. I think it was about Toyota. New CEO, if I'm not mistaken. Let's see. Toyota CEO and president to step down. Toyota CEO steps down amid electric vehicle movement. I heard that basically the CEO of Toyota was leaving because they wanted to, I suppose the shareholders wanted to get in a new CEO that took the sort of EV transition a lot more seriously to try and get ahead of that technology. That's only one example, obviously. Noah Smith's going to probably give different examples to the contrary, perhaps supporting that point, but I just thought that was coincidentally, that was something I read about earlier that I thought was pretty interesting. So let's see. Wingfield Hayes is also right to decry the low productivity menial jobs that Japan has in abundance. Hiring 6 people to do the job of 2 is sadly common in Japan, and it's a big reason why Japanese people earn such low, stagnant wages. The heart of the problem is the lack of new high-growth companies, which is due to deficiencies in R&D, lack of late-stage startup funding, and especially Japanese companies' failure to tap export markets in lieu of their shrinking home market. So Wingfield Hayes is right to see Japan as a country that used to embrace the future and no longer does. And he's right to point the finger at gerontocracy as the key problem. But his broader characterization of Japan as a stagnant, static society is very much off the mark. And I worry that this kind of article leads Western readers to think about Japan in terms of the cliches of the 1980s and 1990s, the post-war manufacturing success, the bubble economy, the lost decade, etc., all of which Wingfield Hayes repeatedly mentions. Those events are certainly important, but they don't really define modern Japan or the challenges it faces in the 2020s. Anyway, now let's talk about some of the big recent changes in Japan that I think Wingfield Hayes failed to appreciate. I suppose number 1, Japan builds and builds and builds. The BBC correspondent's most baffling argument, if I read him right, that the built environment of Japanese cities has stagnated. This would be very strange indeed for a country that famously tears down its buildings after 30 years. Every time I go to Japan, I am stunned at how much new buildings there are. Wingfield Hayes waxes nostalgic about urban landscape of early 1990s Japan. When I arrived in Japan for the first time in '93, what struck me was exquisitely clean and orderly Tokyo was. How exquisitely clean and orderly Tokyo was. Tokyo was a concrete jungle, but it was a beautifully manicured one, I should say. In front of the Imperial Palace in Tokyo, the skyline was dominated by the glass towers of the country's corporate titans, Mitsubishi, Mitsui, Hitachi, and Sony. This was true enough, but in fact, Tokyo is much more like this now than it was in 1993. The city is actually much more beautifully manicured than when I first saw it 2 decades ago. Grunzy Shitamachi areas have been modernized. Many dowdy old Showa-style apartment buildings have been replaced with modern construction. Sculptures and decorations have been added everywhere. Meanwhile, the glittering signs and soaring towers that we associate with urban Japan have only multiplied. If you're impressed by big buildings, for example, it is impossible to miss the vast towering structures that the Maori Building Company is putting up all over the city. The biggest one shown in the photo at the top of this post is due to open this year, but it's not as big. It's not just big towers getting built. Shopping centers, bars, clubs, and glittering Zakyo buildings, the ones with all the signs, continue to multiply. How could you live in Tokyo for a decade and miss all that? In fact, Japan's fervor for constant scrap and build construction is a major reason why rents there is so affordable, and why local politics haven't halted dense development as they have in the West. Wingfield Hayes opened his article by complaining that Japanese houses tend to depreciate instead of appreciate. In Japan, houses are like cars. As soon as you move in, your new home is worth less than what you paid for it, and after you finish paying off your mortgage in 40 years, it is worth almost nothing. It bewildered me that when I first moved here as a correspondent for BBC 10 years on, as I prepared to leave, it was still the same. Weirdly, this is presented as a chronic problem, something that Japan has fixed long ago, but hasn't. But in reality, depreciating real estate is one of Japan's biggest strengths. Because Japanese people don't use their houses as nest eggs as they do in much of the West, there's not nearly as much NIMBYism in Japan. People fight tooth and nail to prevent any local development that they worry might reduce their property values because their property values are going to zero anyway. People don't fight tooth and nail, I should say. As a result, Japanese cities like Tokyo have managed to build enough housing to make housing costs fall. And even as people continue to stream in from the countryside into the city, if you think Japan is stagnant, considering this comparison between Tokyo and some leading Western cities. Annualized rate of housing stock growth in 4 world cities since 1970. So we got New York, Greater London, and Paris, I suppose. I don't know, Paris Unite Urbane, I guess. Maybe that's the full name of Paris, I guess. But yeah, you can see here that obviously Tokyo is, significantly has significantly higher housing stock growth than these other 4 sort of major cities in the world. It looks like Paris has experienced the most drastic decline, let's say, and New York is sort of structurally fallen behind the other 4. But yeah, Tokyo is definitely above the rest, head and shoulders. So even more amazingly, Japan has managed all of this while increasing the size of the average person's home. Average floor space per person in Tokyo Prefecture, 1963 to 2013, over a 50-year period. Average household size, 10 to 30. Is this like the number of people? I mean, the average floor space, but what is this measured in though? Average floor space, average household size, 20 what? I mean, I can't imagine the average house is 20 square feet. Seems a little small. So I'm not sure what this is. Maybe this is 20 square meters or something. I don't know. But yeah, I'm not sure what I may have missed what the unit is here, but I'm not seeing it. But line indeed go up. So line higher here than here. So houses are bigger to some degree. In the bubble era that Wingfield Hayes pines for, Japanese urban apartments were wildly derided as rabbit hutches, but 4 decades later, their floor space per person is similar to European standards and higher than in the UK. Why does Wingfield Hayes think depreciating housing is a problem? Perhaps he believes this means the Japanese middle class is unable to build wealth. But when property tends to depreciate, it means that houses don't cost as much to buy in the first place. The lower price frees up household cash that can be put into stocks and bonds. Basing wealth on productive assets instead of unproductive land is good for the economy. Housing scarcity might pump up prices and build individual wealth for homeowners, but at the national level, it simply holds back economic growth. And as it turns out, it's good for the middle class wealth as well. In 2022, Japan's median wealth per adult was about $120,000 compared to around $93,000 in the US. And this is despite the fact that Japan's once legendary household savings rate has collapsed. So Japan's somewhat unusual choice not to tie middle-class wealth to housing prices seems like a smart one. Over the past 2 decades, the country has done better in terms of housing policy, construction, landscaping, and urbanism than just about any country in the West. And it did this by embracing constant change rather than the physical stagnation that has prevailed in Western cities. Babies, immigrants, and women in management, more than you think. Winfield Hayes, like many others, dings Japan for its low birth rate. A third of Japanese people are over 60, making Japan home to the oldest population in the world. After tiny Monaco, it is recording fewer births than ever before. As I wrote in a post earlier this week, aging is a real problem, but it's a problem that every developed country is dealing with. What few people seem to know is that Japan's fertility rate is actually higher than any of the other countries in its region. This is from Mike Bird, Birdie Word, at Birdie Word on Twitter. A reminder that Japan, the poster child for demographic issues, now has the highest fertility rate in developed East Asia, above Hong Kong or Macau, China, South Korea, or Taiwan. As Bloomberg's Jerioid Reddy has noted, the only reason we associate the low fertility trends with Japan is that it started there first. The BBC correspondent also claims that Japan has not embraced immigration as a solution to its aging problem. Japan's hostility to immigration has not wavered. Only about 3% of Japan's population is foreign-born, compared to 15% in the UK. If you want to see what happens to a country that rejects immigration as a solution to falling fertility, Japan is a good place to start. This would have been a very fair characterization in the 1990s or 2000s, but during Winfield Hayes' decade in the country, Japan's immigration policy changed substantially, and he ought to have noticed. Here's a Bloomberg article I wrote in 2019 about the changes implemented by the late Prime Minister Abe Shinzo. In recent years, the Abe administration has adopted major changes that will probably sustain the influx of immigrants. In 2017, Japan implemented fast-track permanent residencies for skilled workers. In 2018, it passed a law that will greatly expand the number of blue-collar work visas and, crucially, provide these workers with a path to permanent residency if they want it. These changes thus help represent true immigration as opposed to temporary guest worker policies, despite the common use of the term guest worker law to describe the new visas. In time, it will mean a more ethnically diverse Japanese citizenry. Permanent residents are allowed to apply for Japanese citizenship after 5 years. The BBC even reported that with some of these changes when they happen, as a result of these policies and some of the others, the number of foreign-born workers in Japan doubled in the first few years Abe was in power. Workers welcome. The number of foreign workers in Japan has doubled since 2013. Here's the graph. Maybe zoom out a little bit so you can see the whole thing. Let's see. Workers from China, Vietnam, the Philippines, Brazil, the G8 plus Australia and New Zealand, and other. Looks like China has tended to dominate the visas in here. Vietnam is increasing a ton year in year, and then you've got this big other category on top. The 3% number that Winfield Hayes cites represents a dramatic increase over the 1% of just a few years earlier. Tokyo itself is an international city now. In 2018, 1 out of every 8 people turning 20 in the city proper wasn't born in the country. Yet another example is the role of women in the workforce. Winfield Hayes rightfully dings Japan for not having enough women in corporate management, but neglects to mention that the percentage increase from 11% to 15% during his time there, not a massive social transformation, but not a picture of stasis either. Well, I mean, I don't know if I agree with that characterization, right? So, I think going from 11%, I think he lived there in 2012. I mean, going from 11% to 15% in, what is that, 11 years, you know? I don't know if that's as he describes it, not a massive social transformation, but also not a picture of stasis. I mean, this isn't technically stasis, but a 4 percentage point increase over the course of 11 years is not that's not great either. So, maybe in 100 years we'll hit gender parity in Japan, but I don't know about that characterization personally. So maybe there's a stronger argument. We'll read it. So although ahead in female representation in the general workforce, Japan still lags behind the global average in share of women in management roles. Female workers in the general workforce, female workers in management. Well, that's interesting. And this was accompanied by a large-scale movement of women into the workforce, such that Japan's female employment rate now exceeds America's. Out with old cliches. In other words, although Wingfield Hayes lived in Japan during the 2010s, his assessment of the country seems very much stuck in the 1990s. Despite the fact that, by his own admission, he does not speak much Japanese, he really ought to have noticed the big changes that were happening all around him. I'm not even sure what this is. Despite the fact that he does not speak much Japanese, he really ought to have noticed the big changes that were happening all around him. Not sure why. This seems like kind of a sideswipe. I don't know what that was for. Anyway, perhaps you're asking, why does any of this matter? I admit that part of my determination to rebut charges of Japanese stasis is just personal pique irritation at the cliched cultural essentialism that still defines Japan in the minds of too many Westerners. I suppose thinking of Japan in terms of the bubble and crash of the 1980s is less ridiculous than thinking of it in terms of the samurai traditions and the... I'm not even going to try that, but still, come on. Perhaps, though, there actually might be a bit at stake here. As Japan becomes a more open, globalized country, Western ideas and opinions have the potential to change Japan for the better. Outside perspectives could help Japan to solve the very real problems of the 2020s, corporate ossification, technological slowness, etc. But if Westerners essentialize Japan, if they think of it as a country and culture frozen in amber, they won't have much time to offer the country to offer the country in the here and now. Japan is, in fact, a very dynamic and changeable place. Noah Smith, Substacker, mother of God. Let me scroll up. Substacker extraordinaire. Actually, Japan has changed a lot. Pretty good article. I thought it was interesting. I didn't know about the immigration changes in Japan. That was probably the best learning that I could do from this article. Let's see. I'm so biased against housing being treated as an investment, but I digress. Like housing is mostly consumption. After you add furniture, then maintenance costs. Housing too isn't very productive. I mean, maybe, yeah. Chrysanthemum. It's a type of flower. Was that what that word said at the bottom? Chrysanthemum? Chrysanthemum and the sword. Well, you're right. That's fair. Chrysanthemum. It's a type of flower. I guess I knew what a chrysanthemum was, but I had never seen it spelled before. Not a great speller, I suppose. Please update your browser, sir. Oh, yeah, I guess I do. That's fair. But pretty good article about Japan, though. I liked it. Good article from Noah Smith.